For the first time in history, a mighty empire like Velarion, with its formidable fleet and superior technology, was confronted with an inexplicable event. Their fleet, once considered invincible, suddenly vanished into the vastness of space, without a trace, without any debris, and without a single explosion. All their military strategies, all their meticulous preparations became meaningless, as if an invisible force had wiped them out in a single moment. But what was even stranger was that after this event, humanity, a species once seen as weak and easily wiped out, did not face the vengeance of Velarion, but instead an invisible protection from a force that could neither be seen nor heard. This force not only stopped the invasion, but also sent a warning message to all invaders in the galaxy. Strength alone does not guarantee victory. The Velarion Empire, with all its power, had failed, not because of a strategic mistake, but because of a force they could not explain, could not counter. A sense of unease and fear began to spread among those who once believed that this universe could be conquered through military strength. And as all questions about this intervention remained unanswered, other empires in the galaxy began to ask themselves, are there forces we cannot touch, cannot understand, and cannot face? This protection, or perhaps a form of punishment, had changed everything. And what made people shudder was whether we truly understood what was happening or if we were merely living under the protection of a force that no one dared explain. This protection is a warning to all, but who would dare invade when they do not know who they are facing? The Velarion Empire, a powerful empire with a vast fleet and superior technology, entered human space like a storm. They who had conquered thousands of star systems confidently believed that expanding to a small human colony would be an easy task. But they didn't know that with humans, even in moments of what seemed like defeat, they never give up. Velarion had prepared meticulously, deploying its entire force with the most modern warships, experienced troops, and superior weapons of mass destruction. They thought the matter would end quickly. Just a few days from now, they would dominate human space, a species they considered weak and incapable of withstanding their military might. But there was one thing Velarion gravely underestimated. They had failed to account for something they might see as weakness, but in reality it was an incredibly powerful weapon, the unyielding resilience of humans. On the first night when Velarion's fleet entered human space, they encountered no resistance. Their fleet confidently advanced, destroying the small human satellites and annihilating any entity that dared to resist. Velarion thought they had wiped out all resistance, but just a few days later, something unexpected happened. The humans whom they had deemed harmless suddenly retaliated strongly, and the surprise came from a single spaceship. This lone spaceship, devoid of weapons of mass destruction, not carrying powerful warships, was not capable of fighting on par with Velarion's warships. However, it had one factor that Velarion could not predict: the intelligence of humans. The lone spaceship began to fight back, but not in the traditional way. There were no gunshots, no direct attacks. What the spaceship did was disrupt Velarion's strategy, breaking their predictions, forcing them to change tactics without even knowing why. Velarion's fleet began to feel confused. There were no powerful weapons, no formidable military force, yet this ship could still exert a strong influence. Every plan of Velarion was thrown off course. One by one, Velarion's warships started to be unable to approach the human ship without any reasonable explanation. It was a disruption they couldn't explain, and even the most seasoned generals of Velarion didn't know what to do. They thought this war would be easy, but every time they moved toward the human ship, they encountered unexpected obstacles. It wasn't military tactics, but the surprise creativity and survival abilities of humans, something Velarion couldn't calculate. What was strange was that even when the war between the two sides seemed hopeless for humans, they did not surrender. The human spaceship did not retreat. It didn't fire, didn't shoot, but simply made Velarion's army lose its way. Why was this anomaly happening? Velarion began to suspect that something was wrong. But when they decided to attack more aggressively, when their fleet entered human space for the second time, the strange event continued. No traces of war, no debris, no sparks of electricity. Velarion's warships suddenly vanished, leaving no trace. Even though there were no physical signs of an attack, Velarion's fleet no longer existed. But the strangest thing was that it wasn't the humans who had done this. Not a warship, not a spaceship with special weapons, but a force beyond the comprehension of any civilization. Indeed, it wasn't humans. It was a supernatural force. An invisible entity had appeared from somewhere, and its intervention caused the entire Velarion fleet to vanish without a trace. An intervention that Velarion couldn't explain. A force that could not be seen, could not be heard, but had boundless power. It protected humanity and warned all other empires that invasion would not be forgiven. This could not be a coincidence. Humans who were previously considered weak and unworthy of existence had now become the target of a supernatural force protecting them. But why humans, and who was this force? This question began to creep into the minds of Velarion's commanders. They had not only been defeated, but had also been wiped out without understanding why. Humanity had resisted, not with weapons or military might, but with an element that every other civilization had overlooked. The protection of a force that no one could confront. A force that no one in the galaxy could explain. And when Velarion realized this truth, it was already too late. When the Velarion fleet disappeared without a trace, not only the leaders of the Empire, but the entire galaxy stood still, unable to believe their eyes. This was not a normal defeat. A powerful space empire equipped with the most advanced weapons of mass destruction was completely wiped out, without a single shot fired, without a battle, without any devastation. And the strangest thing, humanity was not the culprit. In the gloomy rooms of the Velarion Military Council, the commanders were left with only one question. Who did this? No one could explain. No alien force had the capability to destroy Velarion's fleet without using weapons or military tactics. They had looked down on humanity, considering them a weak species incapable of posing any threat. But now they began to realize that humanity's existence might hold an element they had never anticipated. General Kale, the strategic leader of Velarion, was the first to feel the change. A mighty general, known for his confidence and courage, now found himself filled with confusion and helplessness. Throughout his career, Kale had never faced such a devastating defeat. Every tactic, every plan he had painstakingly devised suddenly became meaningless. There were no weapons, no battles, only silence, and an overwhelming feeling as if an invisible hand had tightened its grip on the heart of the entire empire. However, Kale did not allow himself to be thrown into disarray for too long. Despite the rising sense of confusion within, he maintained an extraordinary calm. "We need to understand this," Kyle said to his officers, his voice deep and cold, as if analyzing a strategic situation. "What happened we will figure out, but do not rush." These words were not just orders, but a reminder to himself of the need to remain steady. No matter how sudden and incomprehensible the situation was, he had to keep his head clear. Queen Solara, the leader of the Velarion Empire, now had to face an undeniable truth. With her supreme position of power, she had always believed that she and her empire were invincible. But this defeat had pushed her to the very edge of fear. No enemy could have caused this strange disappearance except for a supernatural force, something she had never considered. This force did not belong to any civilization in the galaxy, and it protected humanity, a species she had underestimated. The species she had once thought would be an easy target had now become the object of an incomprehensible force. Although stunned and shocked, Solara kept her composure throughout the tense meeting. "We need to understand this force," she spoke, staring at the screen in front of her, where information about the fleet's disappearance continued to appear. "It's not humanity, it's something else. This goes beyond everything we know. Do not let emotions cloud our judgment." She knew that regardless, losing the powerful fleet could not be an accident. What mattered was that they had to uncover this truth before it was too late. While Velarion sought ways to solve their problem, humanity, although not yet understanding what was happening, sensed a strange change in their space. Their space stations, once mundane, suddenly became important hubs. These were hotspots being protected by an invisible force. Every action by humanity was no longer just an attempt to survive, but a part of a larger chain of events, one that no one could foresee. While Velarion searched for ways to resolve their issue, Dr. Aaron, a scientist from the Empire, was the first to recognize something undeniable. Humanity was not the threat. They were the target of a force that no one in the galaxy could comprehend. After conducting research, Dr. Aaron discovered that while humanity might have resisted, it was the intervention of a supernatural force that had stopped Velarion from continuing their invasion. A force that no one could explain, one that could surpass all civilizations. This discovery left Dr. Aaron even more disturbed. How could an entity beyond the understanding of all civilizations exist and protect a weak species like humanity? Could it be some form of compensation for humanity, a grand protection never before recorded in the galaxy's history? Or was this the beginning of a force that both Velarion and other empires must face? There was no doubt now that humanity was not responsible for the strange disappearance. But the question of the supernatural intervention still hung in space unexplained. General Kale and Queen Solara began to realize that if they couldn't understand their opponent, if they couldn't find the source of this force, their invasion would forever fail. Velarion had lost not because of humanity's strength, but because of a force they could neither see nor fight. And the biggest question now was no longer whether Velarion could win, but whether such a powerful empire could survive after facing the intervention of a force it could not control. Would the galaxy witness a great change, a reordering of power where humanity was no longer just part of the universe, but part of a much larger story? After that strange event, an inexplicable feeling spread throughout every corner of the Velarion Empire. The mighty battle fleet, once seen as the pride and symbol of the Empire's strength, had now vanished without a trace. No shots fired, no flashes of light in space, only a deathly silence enveloping everything. The massive warships with their thick metal armor and weapons of mass destruction no longer existed in space. There were no bodies, no debris, no sign of the invasion that had once occurred. All that remained was an empty void, one that no one in the galaxy could explain. The Velarion warships, once the terror of the galaxy, were now just a faint memory. There was only one trace left: the bodies of Velarion soldiers, cold corpses drifting in space like lost souls with no place to go. Their bodies were not prepared for such a scale of war. There were no signs of devastation, just lifeless forms floating in the endless void like reminders of the harshness and surprise of supernatural intervention. One of the last warships of Velarion, the Cerberus, was found a few weeks later, no different from a soulless wreck. Its life support systems still functioned strangely, but no living being remained aboard the ship. All the compartments, every room were empty except for the discarded bodies of soldiers clinging to the walls of the ship like wandering spirits unable to find peace. Their armor, once a part of a destructive war, now stood as inanimate objects, reminders of the cold, mysterious death that had arrived. It was hard to describe the desolation in that vast space. The dust clouds from the lost fleets lingered in space like a ghostly veil covering everything. There was no sound, only silence so thick it was suffocating. The bodies of soldiers drifted everywhere, not dying from war, but from the sudden and incomprehensible intervention of a force beyond control. No blood, no signs of battle. Only the bodies of the warriors, once the lifeblood of the Empire, now just drifting corpses in the eternal void of the universe. As the leaders of Velarion faced this terrifying reality, General Kale felt a terror spreading in his mind. He had fought through countless wars, led many brutal battles, but never had he felt such fear. Every step now felt heavy. Every decision was as weighty as a stone. He had to face the unbelievable. Not humanity, but a supernatural force had intervened in their invasion and erased everything in a moment. The feeling of disorientation and confusion made Kale wonder if he had ever truly understood this universe. Queen Solara could not escape the sense of shock when she saw the images of soldiers' corpses floating in space. They did not die from battle, not from humanity's weapons, but simply because of the absence of one single element, the protection Velarion had once believed was indispensable. From her position of power, she watched the fragments of the Empire she had built, the bodies of soldiers drifting, unable to escape the place where they had been pushed. She began to feel the smallness of herself and the empire she led, in a universe full of forces even she could not control. The Velarion Empire now had only remnants that could not be explained. No war, no weapons of mass destruction, only the desolation of an empire that seemed invincible. The disappearance of the Velarion fleet was a clear warning. It was not the power of technology or the military that decided victory, but the understanding of the limits the universe had imposed. In the silent space, the corpses of the warriors left behind, drifting, stood as a vivid testimony to the intervention of a force no empire could confront. And so the desolation began to spread in the minds of all those who had witnessed it. No trace, no explanation, only an unsettling feeling as if the universe had undergone a permanent change. Something had happened and Velarion could do nothing to return. All that remained was the silence and the lifeless bodies lost in the endless space. After the bodies of Velarion soldiers drifted through the endless void, terror spread across the fleets and base cities of the Empire. The commanders of Velarion were no longer the mighty warriors who had once defeated thousands of enemies in the past. They were now mere confused shadows trapped in the very desolation their empire had left behind. Sleepless nights passed and their bewilderment grew with each passing moment. General Kale and Queen Solara could not help but feel the tension in this space. After the defeat, they had no more battles to fight. Every plan, every strategy had become meaningless. They didn't know what to do next. A sense of despair and paralysis enveloped them. But in the midst of the chaos, they still had to face the truth Velarion had lost, not because of humanity's victory, but because of a supernatural force that they could not explain. The desolate scene seemed to imbue every empty space in Velarion's bases with a profound sense of helplessness. The entire empire could not accept this truth, and no one dared to think about the consequences of this event in the near future. Each fragment of the fleet, each discarded corpse in space became a symbol of failure. No war, no weapons, only an invisible intervention, something that no civilization could stand against. Meanwhile, Dr. Aaron, the brilliant scientist of Velarion, continued to delve into the strange clues. He began analyzing the data samples collected from human space stations and the events that had unfolded in the region Velarion had attacked. What he found could not be explained. There was no presence of humanity in the missing areas and no traces of their attack. Only the strange bodies of Velarion soldiers, as if they had been dragged away by an invisible force, a force no one could comprehend. Gradually, unimaginable hypotheses began to form in Dr. Aaron's mind. Could there be a supernatural force protecting humanity? Something beyond the understanding of the civilizations in the galaxy? And if that were true, could Velarion continue to exist in this universe if they could not understand the origin of this force? These questions haunted Dr. Aaron's mind, and no answer could fully satisfy him. General Kale, despite undergoing intense confusion, still maintained the necessary composure. Every decision he made now was not just about military strategy. He had to face a larger question. Does Velarion still have a place in this galaxy after this event? But he knew that if he could not keep his calm, if he could not face this reality, his empire would not survive this crisis. Humility, understanding, and the ability to accept things beyond their control were the only keys to moving forward. Despite the desolation and terror in General Kale's calmness, there remained a faint glimmer of hope. He understood that the intervention of the supernatural force was not just a punishment, but a warning to all empires, all civilizations in the universe. Velarion could no longer continue its invasion, could not sustain an aggressive strategy without understanding the limits that the universe had set. Queen Solara, though fear still lingered in her eyes, could not deny that the disappearance of the Velarion fleet was a sign of a major change in the galaxy. We were wrong to think that this universe revolves only around military power, she said, her voice soft yet firm. Now we must learn to respect these limits, not just with strength, but with an understanding of the universe and the forces we cannot see. In space, amidst the debris of the Empire, among the silent, drifting corpses, a new story was being rewritten. Velarion had failed not because they were weak, but because they had failed to realize that there are forces in the universe that even a mighty empire cannot conquer. The strange disappearance of Velarion's fleet was a profound lesson. Not all victories come from weapons, not all empires can dominate forever. Forces beyond the understanding of humanity and other civilizations are protecting values they cannot comprehend. And in the silence of the endless void, the price of invasion was paid by the disappearance without a trace of an entire fleet. When the Velarion fleet vanished completely, the desolation was not just a physical sight, but a profound transformation in the psyche of the leaders of this empire. Every room, every council in the strongholds of Velarion no longer held the atmosphere of confidence, strategic discussions, or bold decisions. Instead, there was a sense of emptiness, one that could not be filled. No one could explain the disappearance, but everyone felt that a boundary had been crossed. A line had been erased, and Velarion was now facing the consequences of it. General Kale, once the symbol of strategic strength and decisiveness, was now left with unanswered questions. He stood before the window of the command room, gazing into the vast space beyond where his fleet had once held control. Everything now stood still. No bright stars, no towering warships. All that remained were invisible traces that Velarion could not grasp. He felt a terror he had never experienced. It was not defeat by humanity's army, but the realization that an invisible force, some power, was watching and protecting humanity. "We misjudged," Kale said softly, but in his voice was an evident weariness, a change he had never felt before. The strategies, the plans he had devised now held no meaning. He no longer felt that victory was inevitable. On the contrary, a sense of fear began to creep into his heart, a fear he had never had, not from an opponent, but from the mere presence of a supernatural force he could not understand. Solara, standing beside him, her eyes staring into the endless space, also felt a sensation she could not explain. She was the supreme leader of the Empire, but now before her eyes was not the mighty empire she had once built, but fragments that could not be mended. Her fleet was gone, her army was gone, and her dominion had been wiped out in a moment that defied comprehension. She felt so small it was almost unbelievable, not because of humanity's military strength, but because of the intervention of an invisible force she had never considered throughout her reign. Yet despite this, Solara still managed to retain the necessary composure. She knew that although this loss was unbearable, they could not give up. "We cannot just stand here and let fear control us," she said, her voice still firm, but with a tinge of quiet. "We need to understand this truth. And if there is a force protecting humanity, then we must know why. We cannot let these questions hang in the air." Dr. Aaron, who had been studying these events day and night, could not help but feel a suffocating sense of dread. He looked at the screen before him, where the data of the fleet's disappearance continued to repeat like a painful reminder of the inexplicable failure. Velarion's advanced technologies, its sophisticated algorithms, could not analyze this strange disappearance. He could not accept that an invisible force could manipulate everything. And one thing he could not understand was why humanity was being protected when they were just small creatures in the eyes of other civilizations. But once he had begun the research, Dr. Aaron could not stop. He knew that if they did not understand what was truly happening, Velarion would not be able to continue existing in this universe. You cannot defeat an enemy you cannot see. You cannot fight a force you cannot understand. Velarion's strategies were now completely meaningless, not because humanity was stronger, but because a supernatural force had intervened in a way they could not comprehend. And no matter how hard Velarion tried, they could not win if they didn't understand the limits the universe had set. The universe once again had changed. The intervention of the supernatural force was a clear warning to all invading empires. It was not the power of the military, not weapons of mass destruction, but the respect for the cosmic limits that was the deciding factor. An invisible force had intervened, stopping all attacks and erasing a mighty empire in just a moment. And the warriors of Velarion, once symbols of strength, were now just lifeless corpses drifting in cold space, ignored by all. This desolation would not easily fade from the minds of Kyle, Solara, and the Velarion Empire. This was not just the loss of an army, but a defeat before a power beyond their understanding. And in the endless space, the price of invasion had been paid, but the question of this intervention still had no answer. All that remained was silence, a silence that made every civilization reflect. As the Velarion Empire had not yet recovered from the sudden collapse of its fleet, something that their commanders never expected happened. In the vast, boundless, and infinite space where there was no trace of the invasion, a message was sent, not from a warship, not from an alien civilization, but from an invisible force beyond the understanding of all civilizations. And this message was as clear as a warning to Velarion and all other invading empires. Strength alone does not allow you to invade without consequence. This was the cold and stern warning that all invaders in the universe had to hear. In space where no one could see, no one could hear a voice echoed in the minds of Velarion's leaders. It was not a roar, not a spoken word, but a powerful sensation that reached into every one of their minds, a reminder that this galaxy does not tolerate reckless invasions, and the intervention of this force will not cease until all enemies understand this. General Kell stood motionless, his hands gripping the command desk. his eyes searching the vast space as though looking for a sign, some form of that force, but all was empty. He felt a coldness rising in his heart, a feeling of being chased by something he could not explain. He knew that this warning was no game. It was a definite statement from a force that Velarion could not oppose. Queen Solara, standing beside General Kale, also sensed a change in the space around them. She had led this empire for many years, and now she sensed something she had never thought possible. An invisible force, one that could not be seen, could not be touched, yet could change the existence of an empire, even the entire galaxy. She said nothing, only stood still, her eyes fixed on the vast void of space before her mind full of thoughts. "We were wrong," Solara whispered, but her voice seemed to be absorbed into the infinite emptiness. "It is not only strength that decides everything. We cannot always impose dominance on this galaxy without consequences." These words escaped her lips like a delayed realization after everything had already gone too far. Still, she tried to maintain a cold expression, not letting her emotions take over too much. Dr. Aaron, meanwhile, felt a different sensation. After many nights of studying the disappearance of the fleet and the strange clues he had uncovered, he realized that this was not just a punishment. It was a warning not just for Velarion, but for all the invaders in the galaxy. Humanity was not the main target. They were merely the species intervened upon to stop the uncontrolled invasion. He recalled what he had read, the ancient documents about supernatural forces that other civilizations had only heard of. Things that humanity had never known, but now they appeared and protected the species that other empires had considered weak. Dr. Aaron realized that this galaxy was not just a playground for powerful empires, but a balanced system that no civilization had the right to disrupt. Sent through space, the message was a clear warning for all. Empires could no longer live in their arrogance. The powerful had no right to invade and break the natural boundaries of this universe. If they did, they would pay the price. And Velarion, with all its military strength and technology, was the first example in a lesson that all other invaders needed to learn. "We cannot win a war we do not understand," General Kale said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "The intervention of this force is a price we cannot calculate, but it is also a reminder for all other empires. If we do not respect the limits that the universe has set, we will never survive." The warning had been sent not only to Velarion, but to every empire, every civilization in the galaxy. This was not a war of armies of weapons, but a war between invisible boundaries, a war that humanity and other civilizations must learn to respect. And Velarion now was the one paying the price for an invasion they could not comprehend. Silence still enveloped the space. But in that silence, all empires realized one thing: this galaxy does not tolerate reckless invasions. An invisible force is protecting this universe, and no one in the galaxy can surpass the limits it has set. Of a great empire. Its leaders, one by one, felt the spreading confusion within their hearts. General Kyle, despite being a seasoned strategist, could not escape an unexplainable fear. Every night he could not sleep. The silence in the command room made him feel suffocated, as if an invisible storm was waiting to strike. It was not the defeat, but the realization of something inexplicable, a force that he could not control. A chilling sensation spread through Kale's mind. The images of the Velarion fleet's disappearance kept repeating in his head. No traces, no bodies, only fragments, drifting aimlessly, with no explanation, no reason. And that was when Kale realized that Velarion, this mighty empire, was not facing an enemy that could be defeated through war or weapons. They were facing something that, even with all their strength and knowledge, they could not contend with. Queen Solara, too, could not maintain her usual cold composure. Confronted with the incredible truth, she began to perceive the weakness in her own empire. The meetings, the important decisions, no longer came easily. The commanders, the leaders of Velarion, no longer displayed the confidence they once had. They could not hide their fear when facing situations they had once easily handled. She could not forget the images of the bodies drifting in space, not because of destruction or war, but because of the inexplicability of it all. Her soldiers, those who had given their all, were now nothing but lifeless bodies like spirits, unable to move on. Velarion's arrogance had now turned into fear of an invisible force that no one could contend with. Despite her strong belief in her power, she knew deep down that Velarion no longer had the strength to face a force they could not understand. While Velarion's leaders began to recognize their impotence, their attacks and new military campaigns were no longer launched with the same decisiveness as before. The surrounding empires began to notice the change in Velarion. A once mighty empire that had made the entire galaxy tremble was now just a shadow of its former self. Velarion's strategists were no longer confident, their armies no longer enthusiastic, and their cities, once symbols of power, were now desolate and empty. The Velarion Empire had gradually become a ghost of itself. They could no longer expand, no longer invade, and could no longer maintain their dominance. A sense of fear, one they had never felt before, began to invade their hearts. Never had the leaders of Velarion felt so small and helpless. Dr. Aaron, who had been researching the supernatural intervention, began to realize that Velarion could not continue on its current path. This empire, with all its power, could not survive if it did not change its perspective on the universe. The scientists who had worked their entire lives to develop technology and military strategies could no longer find a solution for the intervention they could not explain. There could be no victory when you don't understand your enemy. Since the event that erased the fleet, Velarion was no longer a fearsome empire. They were no longer pioneers in technology, no longer invincible conquerors. They had become an exhausted empire, no longer believing in themselves, no longer hoping for the future. Meanwhile, humanity, with its inherent strength and resilience, began to realize that they no longer had to live under the shadow of an oppressive empire. A transformation was taking place in the galaxy. Velarion, the mighty empire, now had nothing left but to live in fear, waiting for an inevitable outcome. They could no longer expand their empire, could no longer continue the war they could not win. They had lost the power and dominance they once had. And now, in the desolation, they were left with only one question: would there be any chance for recovery, or would they be completely erased like the fleets they had lost? As the Velarion Empire gradually weakened, humanity stood at a major turning point in its history. The whole world had witnessed Velarion's invasion and had thought that this was the moment humanity would be subdued. But now something unexpected had happened. Humanity no longer faced a mighty empire, no longer had to fight with military might or advanced weapons. They realized that their true enemy was not Velarion, but an invisible supernatural force they could not control. Contrary to what humanity had believed, it was this very force that had protected them. Not by armies, not by the courage of warriors or brilliant strategies, but by the miraculous protection of a force that no one could comprehend. Humanity suddenly realized that true power did not come from military strength or war, but from something far beyond what they could measure: a supernatural force that could not be defeated by conventional methods. At the space stations, humanity's colonies began to have intense discussions about the strange events that had just occurred. The military leaders who had once prepared to confront Velarion's invasion no longer had to worry about fighting against a mighty army. What they now concerned themselves with was the appearance of a force they could not fight, an invisible force that no weapon could defeat. In the command room of a remote colony base, Captain Elias Grant, one of humanity's commanders, stood facing his comrades, his expression pensive. Until now, he had fought in many battles facing powerful enemies, but never had he encountered something so inexplicable. "We won, but not because of our own strength," Elias said, his voice slow and sure. "We didn't fight with weapons or strategy. Something happened and we were protected." The people in the command room listened quietly, but their eyes could not hide their amazement. They had fought with everything they had, but now they realized that this invasion was not the only challenge they had to face. A bigger question began to rise in each of their hearts. Are humans really surviving because of their own strength, or is there a force protecting them? This protection, though strange and incomprehensible, brought both a sense of wonder and fear. Humanity had come to realize that there were forces in the universe that they could not control, but these very forces were the ones calling the shots. And unlike the other empires, humanity could not coerce or conquer them. Instead, they had to learn to respect and even depend on this protection. "That's why we're still alive," Dr. Rachel Voss, a scientist, spoke up while analyzing data from the space stations. "Humans may not be as strong as the other empires, but we have something they don't. Something we can't understand. Something that protects us." Humanity now no longer had to fight for survival. They had to live in harmony with this invisible protection. Military strategies and advanced weapons had become meaningless in the face of this supernatural force. The truth that humanity was gradually realizing was that they no longer had to fight for the right to live. They no longer had to fear being invaded by any empire. They were protected not by military might, but by a force that no empire in the galaxy could oppose. From the confusion and uncertainty, humanity had found a new strength, a peace they could not explain. And this not only changed how they viewed themselves, but it also changed the entire future of the galaxy. Other empires, other invading civilizations, now had to realize that there were limits that even military strength could not surpass. Humanity had not only survived, they had proven that their existence meant more than any military victory. While other empires and civilizations would continue to vie for power, humanity had found another path, one that didn't rely on domination and conquest, but on respect and invisible protection. With these new understandings, humanity began to enter a new era. They were no longer the creatures that were looked down upon, but beings protected by a supernatural force that no one could understand. And although this brought safety, it also brought questions that had yet to be answered. Would humanity continue to live under this protection, or one day would they have to face forces they could not control? Whatever the case, humanity was no longer just survivors. They were beings with a great mystery within them, a mystery that could change the entire galaxy. And in the silence of space, the only thing humanity could do was continue to live, continue to explore, and hope that this protection would never fade away. Since the Velarion fleet mysteriously disappeared, Dr. Aaron and the scientists of Velarion threw themselves into the search for clues about the supernatural force they suspected had intervened in the conflict. Initially, they thought the disappearance of the fleet was just a coincidence. But when they witnessed the complete absence of any trace of warfare, they couldn't help but believe that an invisible force had intervened in this event. Dr. Aaron, a scientist with a deep background in astronomy and cosmic physics, began to suspect that this wasn't just an ordinary invasion. It wasn't military tactics, technological superiority, or strategies that had caused Velarion's defeat, but something that went beyond what they could explain with their current science. A supernatural entity, a force that even the most sophisticated measurement tools of Velarion could not detect. Despite this, the unanswered questions made Dr. Aaron uneasy. How could there be an invisible, undetectable force that could cause such massive devastation? Was there a deeper reason why Velarion was erased? And why was humanity, a species considered weak by other civilizations, being protected? The scientists of Velarion, who had spent centuries researching and developing advanced technologies, now faced something they couldn't find an answer to. Every theory about the universe, about space and time, about life and death, failed to explain the intervention of this supernatural force. What they knew about the universe suddenly became meaningless. Dr. Aaron and his team began to examine ancient records, searching for traces from vanished civilizations. Ancient documents about strange events, myths about forces that protected the universe began to surface. Each record, each document, though unclear, had one thing in common: they all spoke of an invisible entity, a force that protected the weak against reckless invasions. But these documents were merely fragments, not enough to form a complete picture. One night, while Dr. Aaron was pondering an ancient record from a long-lost civilization, he suddenly felt a change. It wasn't from technology or science, but from instinct, an awakening. In a brief moment, he saw more clearly than ever before that the intervention of the supernatural force was not a coincidence. It was part of a larger plan that he couldn't yet understand, but one that was clearly undeniable. He began to focus all his attention on researching the protective force. A force that did not belong to any civilization, had no form, no name, and only one purpose: to protect the weak and prevent invasions. But the strange thing was that in all the ancient documents he had read, there was no information indicating what this entity was, where it came from, or how it could have such enormous power. One morning, while studying a set of stone-engraved records from an ancient forgotten civilization, Dr. Aaron stumbled upon a shocking description. This description wasn't just a simple portrayal of an invisible entity, but a connection to humanity. It contained an ancient message passed down through generations, speaking of a war that humanity would have to face, not with the armies of empires, but with a protective entity, an invisible force that would never back down, would never let humanity be destroyed, and would appear when humanity was most threatened. "We cannot win if we do not understand it," Dr. Aaron muttered in astonishment. He realized that despite Velarion's might, despite their fleet and superior technology, they had failed because they didn't understand the origins and purpose of this supernatural force. And now Velarion would face unimaginable consequences for invading a species they knew nothing about, unable to comprehend their protection. As Dr. Aaron continued his research, other scientists at Velarion also noticed that the data collected from the space stations lacked any clear explanation. Every question raised, but no answer was sufficiently satisfying. Perhaps the truth about the protective force of humanity would never be known, or it would only be revealed when it was too late. But Dr. Aaron and Velarion scientists came to an inevitable conclusion. They could not win a war they could not understand. They were not just facing humanity, but a force that no strategy or technology could counter. And that was why Velarion was facing the unavoidable collapse. General Kale stood motionless before the control desk, the dim light from the screens casting shadows on his face, creating contrasting streaks of light and dark. Before him, the numbers remained still unchanging, untouched. The strategic data, the ship metrics, the battle statistics, all were in their original state without any alteration. But in Kale's mind, everything was in turmoil. These numbers, these familiar images, no longer brought him the comfort they once did. He still could not understand. How could there be no trace? How could a fleet with massive warships and the most advanced military technology disappear so mysteriously? No explosions, no signs of battle, no debris in space. Just silence. A silence as if his fleet had never existed. The fear continued to build within Kale. He was a strategist, a soldier who had faced unpredictable wars, but he had never felt so powerless. All the tactics he had learned and applied throughout his career now seemed meaningless. Not because Velarion lacked strength, but because an invisible force that he could neither understand nor see was intervening and erasing everything he had once considered certain. He turned around and slowly walked toward the window of the room, gazing out into the vastness of space. The distant stars were just faint lights in the endless dark. A sense of unease, something he had never felt before, spread through him. Everything was no longer simple. He had misjudged this universe, the existence of civilizations, and the invisible forces at play. Cal wondered, how could there be no trace? Could it be that this intervention was not humanity's revenge, not due to the weakness of their army, but from a force he had never known, a force that no warship or military weapon could resist? The warning he had never paid attention to now became a terrifying reality. It's impossible, Cal muttered, his voice trembling. There can't be a supernatural force that exists without leaving any trace. He began to feel that he was standing before an invisible wall that he could not break. Everything he knew about war, about strategy, was now irrelevant. No method could explain this. At that moment, a new thought crossed Cal's mind, a thought he didn't want to admit. How could there be no trace? Everything he was facing could be part of an ancient intervention, a civilization that had existed thousands or perhaps millions of years ago. A civilization that might have vanished without leaving a trace, just like the disappearance of Velarion's fleet. Cal began to recall the stories, the legends that Velarion's strategists had once read and dismissed as mere myths, unverifiable tales. But now he realized that perhaps these myths were true. Ancient civilizations, great wars from an era that no technology of Velarion could comprehend, might be hidden within this very intervention. We are not the only ones in this universe. That thought echoed in Kale's mind like a thunderclap. His empire might be the most powerful in the galaxy, but even Velarion could not escape the intervention of a force they could not predict. Civilizations that had once existed and disappeared in the silence of the universe, they might have faced similar things. Supernatural forces, invisible interventions that no technology or weapon could resist. Kale realized that he was facing something that went beyond every tactic, every military theory he had ever known. This was not a regular battle, not a war of technology or armies, but a fight for existence, an existence that not everyone could understand. Waves of confusion, fear, and despair continued to assault Kyle, but he did not allow himself to crumble. He had faced more perilous situations, led armies into battles that seemed impossible to win. But this time was different. This time he had to face an invisible entity, an intervention that he could not fight back against. And what terrified him most was that there was nothing to fight with. No weapon, no strategy, only the invisible presence of a force he could not explain. Are we facing an ancient civilization? Kale asked himself, his voice faltering. A civilization that vanished and now returns to protect what they deem important? He didn't know the answer, but he knew that Velarion, no matter how strong, could not win if they didn't understand what was truly happening. And in that moment, Kale realized an undeniable truth. It was not just military strength that could win in this universe. Protection, respect for the limits that the universe had set was the deciding factor. And Velarion, with all their pride and power, had no choice but to face this truth. After the complete failure of Velarion's fleet, the Empire's leaders had no choice but to find a way to explain and deal with the supernatural intervention they could not understand. High-level discussions took place in the conference room, where Velarion's strategists, scientists, and top commanders gathered, trying to figure out how to communicate with a force they could not see. The strategy tables were still covered with maps, charts, and data, but everything had become meaningless in the face of the absence of any clear response from this force. General Kell, who had felt helpless from the early days after the fleet's disappearance, couldn't help but feel like a weakling in a race with an invisible force. He sat silently in the corner of the room, his hand clenched on the table, his eyes staring at the data screens. Everything in the room felt lifeless. There was no trace to indicate that this force could be controlled or negotiated with. All the efforts Velarion had made in the past days had only led to frustration. "We've tried everything," Cal said, his voice deep and weary. "We've sent countless messages into the void, into the deep layers of time, hoping for a response, a sign, even just a warning. But all we've received is silence." Queen Solara, the leader of the Empire, no longer wore the cold and confident expression she once had. She had witnessed many failures, but this silence made her feel like a lost soul in her own empire. Every negotiation, every attempt to adjust military strategy now felt like a futile effort. "We can't continue like this," she spoke, but her voice sounded weak, as if no longer carrying the strength she once had. "We've tried everything, sent thousands of messages, but there's no response." The other leaders, who had faced thousands of battles, were now confronted with something they had never considered, an adversary they could not defeat, could not understand, and most importantly, could not negotiate with. An invisible force capable of erasing an empire as powerful as Velarion without leaving a trace. Only the deathly silence remained. Investigations, scientific experiments, and even negotiations had all yielded no results. Dr. Aaron, Velarion's chief scientist, stood up and approached the control panel. "I've analyzed the layers of space. The signals we've sent weren't disrupted or manipulated, but there's no response, no trace suggesting that we can communicate with this force." He paused briefly, as if reflecting on what he had just said, not because of a lack of means, but because they don't want to respond. Perhaps they don't need to. This realization caused the entire room to fall into silence. A vague fear began to spread in the hearts of Velarion's leaders. They had come to this point no longer able to fight, no longer able to negotiate, left with an unfillable void. All the technology, all the strategies they had created could not deal with this force. In the following days, Velarion's leaders continued to send messages, hoping for a sign, hoping for a change. They had tried every method, from using special communication channels to trying ancient methods of forgotten civilizations. But all they received was endless silence. One night, as Kale stood alone in the control room, the stars outside the window suddenly became dim. He felt the silence weigh on his mind. How long had it been since he had felt such quiet? A silence that wasn't rest, but a hopeless waiting. Everything Velarion had once known about power strategy and domination in this universe no longer mattered. This supernatural force came not from a place they could face, but from a presence they could not defeat, could not control, and could not understand. And the more they tried to comprehend it, the more they realized that this game was not theirs to play. Kyle clenched his fist, staring at the screen before him. "Perhaps we are not the only ones in this universe," he whispered. "Perhaps these are the forces we've never known, forces that can only be felt when they arrive." But whatever the force was, whether an ancient civilization, mythical legends, or an intervention from an invisible entity, Velarion was left with nothing but waiting. Unable to fight, unable to negotiate, only an eternal void that could never be filled. And in that silence, Velarion had to face a painful truth. Their invasion was not just a failure, it was an irreparable lesson. Empires that had once ruled this universe must realize that not always can they win, and not always is military power the answer. Since the collapse of Velarion's fleet, the galaxy has never been the same. Empires once accustomed to manipulating and invading small worlds no longer felt the confidence they once had. The reckless attacks they had carried out now faced an invisible presence they could not touch. A powerful, uncontrollable supernatural force had intervened in Velarion's war and sent a clear warning to all invading empires in the galaxy: strength alone does not guarantee you can invade without punishment. Representatives from other empires began to view this change with suspicion and fear. In high-level meetings of the Galactic Council, leaders and strategists were faced with a question they had never considered before. If a powerful empire like Velarion, with superior military and technological strength, couldn't invade without encountering the intervention of a supernatural force, what awaits us? A small empire like humanity may not be an immediate threat, but the invisible protection they received made larger empires rethink their goals and actions. The leaders of other empires, despite their great arrogance, now had to face an uncomfortable truth. This galaxy was not theirs alone, and they could not do whatever they wished. This intervention is a sign Ambassador Zoran of the Krath Empire said in a meeting of the Galactic Council, his voice deep and serious. Velarion had to pay the price for its reckless invasion, and we, the other empires, will not be allowed to ignore these cosmic limits. His words rang like a warning bell. A new era was beginning where military power was no longer the deciding factor. Instead, empires began to realize they must respect the boundaries the universe had set. Boundaries they had never before considered were now becoming insurmountable. No empire, no matter how powerful, could expand its territory at will without facing the consequences of invisible forces they could not fight. We didn't understand this universe enough. Queen Alira of the Thalan Empire exclaimed, her voice clearly tinged with concern. If Velarion, with all their strength, could not withstand this force, how can we? Her question was not just a reflection of fear, but a deep realization of the changes the galaxy was undergoing. The intervention of the supernatural force was not just a punishment, but a warning that this galaxy does not tolerate invasion and oppression. The great empires would have to learn to respect the species and planets they could not control and the limits they could not surpass. Meanwhile, humanity, though not fully understanding the supernatural protection they had received, began to realize the change they could not avoid. Their space stations, their small colonies on distant planets, had now become beacons in the galaxy, and humanity, though still small and weak in the eyes of other empires, had proven an important truth. They were no longer just survivors, but beings protected by a force no one could touch. For every empire in the galaxy, a period of reflection began. Reckless invasions would no longer be forgiven. The cosmic boundaries had been established and protected, and every civilization in the galaxy would have to respect these limits. The intervention of the supernatural force was not just a strange occurrence Velarion had to face, but a warning for all other empires. They could no longer live in arrogance, nor could they consider themselves the absolute masters of this galaxy. This galaxy, once vast and full of mysteries, now faced an undeniable truth. A new era was beginning, and respect for the cosmic limits would be the deciding factor in the future of every civilization. Humanity, though not mighty warriors or armed with advanced technology, had now proven that there are forces more powerful than military domination. And from here, the galaxy would change. No empire could invade without facing consequences. What Velarion experienced would be the lesson for all civilizations in this galaxy. The intervention of the supernatural force was an irreversible turning point, and all empires would have to learn to respect the limits of the universe, because if they didn't, they would face consequences no one could foresee. Since the disappearance of Velarion's fleet, the galaxy was never the same. The story of the mysterious disappearance of a mighty empire, the supernatural intervention, and the invisible protection of humanity had sparked a profound shift in how civilizations viewed one another. What the empires once considered eternal, like military strength and warfare strategies, now seemed insignificant in the face of the boundaries the universe had set. Empires once rivals now began to reconsider their place in the cosmic game. They realized that domination did not only come from military power or advanced technology, but also from the ability to respect the limits the universe had imposed. An invisible, unpredictable supernatural entity had intervened and stopped the war that the empires thought they would win. This forced them to confront a painful truth: not all victories come from strength. Not every war can be won by force, Ambassador Zoran of the Krath Empire stated during an international meeting of empires, his voice deep and serious, carrying a new understanding. We thought military domination was everything, but now the galaxy has changed. We cannot continue to think we can invade and control this universe without facing serious consequences. Zoran was not the only one realizing this change. Representatives from other empires, from the mightiest civilizations to the smallest, had to face this new reality. After witnessing Velarion's collapse, they all felt something they could not control. An invisible power had changed everything, and now they had to change how they viewed themselves and this galaxy. Reckless invasions and military strategies, once considered necessary by the empires, no longer gave them the confidence they once had. The story of Velarion and the intervention of the supernatural force had become a lesson for all. Empires now had to learn to respect the limits of the universe, understanding that not every invasion or conquest would result in lasting victory. Queen Alira of the Thalan Empire, one of the most veteran leaders in the galaxy, stood up during a meeting later. "We can't continue living in arrogance," she said, her eyes full of understanding and resolve. "We must change how we act, learn to live peacefully with each other, and respect the limits the universe has set." Her words resonated like a declaration for a new era of peace that the empires had never considered. Over the years, the wars between civilizations had caused immense suffering and loss. But now, with the supernatural intervention breaking all expectations, the empires began to realize that peace could be a choice, something achievable if they all respected the universe's limits. Diplomatic talks between the empires began to deepen, no longer filled with arrogance, no longer arguments over power, but discussions focused on cooperation, sharing resources, and protecting the weaker planets from the devastation of war. Empires no longer saw each other as enemies, but as partners in a galaxy full of challenges, a galaxy they had to protect together. With the change in the empire's mindset, civilizations also began to adjust their strategies. No longer would there be random attacks or reckless invasions. Instead, empires began focusing on building alliances, developing cooperative technologies, and finding ways to live peacefully with one another. Humanity, though still small compared to the larger empires, began to feel this change. Not because of their military strength, but because of the supernatural protection they received, humanity now became an important part of the galaxy. The empires no longer viewed humanity as weak creatures, but as a species that needed to be protected and respected. In this process, humanity also realized they were no longer the invaded species, but a part of a larger event, an irreversible change in the universe. From an empire on the brink of collapse, Velarion now no longer stood as a model of dominance, but as an example of the cosmic limits that cannot be surpassed. And from the story of the mysterious disappearance of Velarion's fleet, all the empires in the galaxy had come to understand that they must change. They must learn to respect boundaries and how to live peacefully with each other. A new era began where empires had to learn to coexist rather than dominate in a universe that cannot be fully controlled. The universe was no longer a place to invade. It was a place to respect and protect. And this change would affect all those who dared to enter it. After the shift in how civilizations viewed one another, humanity was no longer seen as weak creatures crushed beneath the feet of great empires. They didn't just survive, they had become a new symbol of strength and resilience in the universe. The invisible protection that humanity received from the supernatural force had ushered in an era of peace where civilizations learned to respect each other and live in harmony. Though there were still mighty empires, no one dared to view humanity as creatures easily subdued. On the contrary, humanity had proven that true strength didn't always come from military power or advanced technology, but from the ability to survive the harshest of conditions. They had endured invasions, overcome attacks from powerful empires, and now they were not only protected, but had become an integral part of the new order in the galaxy. With this newfound awareness of the cosmic limits, empires now turned their focus from war to cooperation. Alliances between civilizations grew stronger, and areas that had been ravaged by war were now becoming cultural and economic crossroads. Humanity, not only thanks to the invisible protection they received, but also due to their creativity, perseverance, and an unwavering will to never give up, had found their place in this new world. "We didn't just survive, we've overcome everything." This was the statement of Ambassador Alara Voss, who had led humanity through its hardest years when invading empires sought to wipe out humankind. Now she stood before the Galactic Council, a symbol of resilience and a species that had proven they could stand firm in the face of the greatest challenges. What we've gone through is proof of humanity's true strength, not military power, but mental fortitude, the ability to stand tall in the dark and find the light at the end of the tunnel. Humanity had proven that no matter how many trials and dangers the universe held, they were not creatures easily defeated. They had learned the most important lesson: survival was not just about fighting, but about the ability to harmonize and exist in an unpredictable universe. And while other empires continued to wrestle with maintaining their power, humanity had found another path, the path of peace and respect. These accomplishments did not come solely from the supernatural protection humanity received, but also from their efforts to learn and develop to build relationships with other civilizations. They began to expand their understanding of the universe, and instead of invading and fighting, they chose cooperation and growth. On a foggy morning, as the light from distant stars illuminated the surface of humanity's space stations, the change became apparent. The great empires began to view humanity as a partner, an essential force in the galaxy's future. No longer were they seen as a species to be looked down upon, but as friends, vital allies in maintaining peace and prosperity in the universe. The alliances between humanity and other civilizations continued to grow stronger. The planets humanity had built into colonies had now become centers of cultural, scientific, and technological exchange. The great empires, though still holding their power, could no longer ignore humanity's importance. They began to invite talent, share technology and knowledge, and live together peacefully in a galaxy no longer defined by reckless invasion. Humanity, from a small and vulnerable civilization, had become a symbol of resilience, of protection that overcame all challenges. They didn't just survive, they thrived not just as part of the galaxy, but as a force driving change. And while other empires might continue to seek power, humanity had chosen the path of peace, the path of strong and enduring alliances. The Velarion Empire, once the model of military dominance, was no longer the only force capable of altering the galaxy's fate. Other civilizations, including humanity, had proven that existence was not just about military power, but about the ability to respect, cooperate, and live in peace. And when other empires realized this, they began to alter their strategies, respecting the boundaries the universe had set. A new era was beginning, and in this new world, humanity was no longer just survivors. They had become a symbol of strength, resilience, and the determination to never give up. This galaxy was no longer a place of reckless invasions, but a place where civilizations respected each other and worked together to build a shared future. The universe, with all its vastness and mysteries, had witnessed a great change. Velarion's invasion was not just a military defeat, but a profound lesson in strength, resilience, and compassion. Humanity, once seen as fragile creatures, had shown that true power did not come from armies or technology, but from the ability to overcome adversity, from perseverance, and the willingness to change in order to live peacefully with one another. We cannot win a war if we don't understand the enemy and ourselves. What matters is not military power, but respecting the natural limits of this universe. Humanity has learned that peace is not a random occurrence, but a choice that every civilization must make. Empires in the galaxy are no longer just enemies, but partners with whom we must learn to coexist, respect, and collaborate. We have overcome great trials not because we were stronger, but because we knew humility and respected things we couldn't understand. And when all civilizations realize that peace is the key to sustainable growth, a new era will begin, an era of understanding and cooperation where all creatures in this universe can live in peace, respect each other, and move toward a brighter future. Hoi ChatGPT.